A millionaire left his wife behind, chasing luxury and ambition with no regrets. But while he basked in wealth, she quietly built something of her own. Now, fate brings them face to face once more, but with the power shifted, what happens when the tables finally turn? The ocean breeze whispered through the open windows of the villa, carrying the scent of salt and luxury into every corner of the massive beachfront property. Outside, the sun glistened on the endless stretch of sapphire blue water, while inside, the air hummed with the lazy hum of indulgence. Crystal glasses clinked, designer silk curtains danced softly in the wind, and the marble floors felt cool beneath bare feet. Everything about this place screamed affluence, the kind of wealth that doesn't think twice about renting a villa that could swallow an entire neighborhood back home. Richard Thornton lounged on the plush leather couch, his tan perfectly even from days spent on the yacht, and his linen shirt unbuttoned just enough to reveal a gold chain resting against his chest. His fingers lazily swirled the amber liquid in his glass. Scotch, aged, smooth, imported. He liked the burn. It reminded him he was still in control. His Rolex glinted under the sunlight filtering through the glass walls as he took another sip and leaned back. This was his life. Success, comfort, power. Richard, did you see the forecast? Her voice was soft yet demanding, like the hum of an engine that needed oiling. He looked up to see Amelia standing in front of the window, one hand resting on her hip while the other scrolled through her phone. She was wearing a white sundress, the fabric clinging just enough to highlight the kind of figure that had turned heads at every party they'd attended. Her sleek blonde hair cascaded past her shoulders, catching the golden glow of the sunset. He smiled lazily. "Why do I care about the weather, Amelia? I have people who check that for me." She rolled her eyes playfully, her red-painted lips curling into a smirk. "Because, darling, if there's a storm tomorrow, we'll have to cancel the yacht party. And that would be a tragedy, wouldn't it? A tragedy for you." "Maybe," Richard chuckled, setting his glass down on the marble coffee table. "For me, it's just another day." He didn't mean it as a slight, but there was an underlying tone of detachment in his voice, one that Amelia had grown accustomed to over the last year. She didn't mind, though. She wasn't here for deep conversations. She was here for the lifestyle, the connections, and the thrill of being on the arm of a man who could snap his fingers and make things happen. As she walked toward him, barefoot and graceful, her phone vibrated, and she quickly checked the screen. A brief frown appeared before she brushed it away. "Work email," she murmured. "Nothing important." Richard reached for her hand and pulled her down beside him, his gaze drifting over her face. "You worry too much," he said, running a hand through her hair. "We're on vacation. Let someone else handle it." She laughed, leaning into him. "I like to stay ahead. You taught me that, remember?" "Smart girl," he whispered. But his mind was already elsewhere. His gaze wandered past the infinity pool that stretched toward the ocean, beyond the cliffs where waves crashed rhythmically against the rocks. For a moment, the peace of the moment unsettled him. He was a man who thrived on action, on closing deals, negotiating power plays, and making sure his empire remained untouchable. This villa was supposed to be a break from all that, but breaks made him restless. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. He reached for it without thinking, expecting a reminder from his assistant about the meeting scheduled for next week. Instead, the notification that popped up caught him off guard. Missed payment notice. Joint property investment. Richard's brows knitted together as he opened the email. The property tied to Margaret's name had fallen behind on payments. The words seemed foreign to him, as if they belonged to someone else's problem. For years, financial hardship hadn't been a phrase that existed in his vocabulary. What had she done to let this happen? Something wrong? Amelia asked, her voice light but curious. He quickly locked the screen and forced a smile. Nothing important, but it was important. And it wasn't like Margaret to make mistakes like this. She had always been meticulous, keeping track of details he never had the patience for. They had built the foundation of his empire together. Her sharp financial mind, his vision, and their combined ambition. But that was years ago, before he outgrew her practicality. Now, she was little more than an afterthought, managing whatever leftover investments he'd passed along to her out of convenience. He exhaled, brushing the thought aside. Margaret would figure it out. She always did. "Let's talk about something more interesting," he said, shifting his focus back to Amelia. "Like what you plan to wear to the yacht party. Assuming it doesn't get rained out." Her laughter filled the room, light and carefree, and for a moment, he let himself enjoy it. Across town, Margaret Thornton sat alone at the kitchen table, surrounded by unpaid bills and an empty coffee cup. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room, a dull background noise that matched the weight pressing on her chest. She ran a hand through her dark brown hair, now streaked with strands of gray that seemed to have appeared overnight. Her eyes, once bright with ambition, were tired, reflecting the strain of someone carrying more than her share of the burden. She picked up the letter from the bank, rereading the words she already knew by heart. Final notice of delinquency. Her fingers tightened around the paper before she set it down gently, as if holding it too long would burn her. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had once been the woman who balanced million-dollar budgets without breaking a sweat, the woman who could spot a financial risk before anyone else did. But now, with Richard gone, the cracks were starting to show. The phone buzzed on the counter, and she reached for it instinctively. The name on the screen made her pause. James Donovan, an old friend, mentor, and someone who had once believed in her potential long before she became Mrs. Thornton. Her heart thumped as she answered. "James." "Margaret." His familiar voice was warm, steadying. "I was thinking about you today. Wanted to see how you're holding up." She bit her lip, willing her voice to remain steady. "I'm managing. I heard about Richard's latest acquisition," he said carefully, as if gauging her reaction. Margaret's grip on the phone tightened. "I'm not involved in that anymore." "I know," James replied, his tone softening. "But I also know that doesn't mean you've stopped paying attention." She smiled faintly. "Old habits." "Listen," he continued, "if you ever want to get back into the game, there's a project I'm working on that could use someone with your experience. It's small for now, but I have a feeling it could grow." Margaret's breath hitched slightly. For the first time in months, she felt something other than dread. A flicker of hope, of possibility. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice stronger than before. As she hung up, the weight on her chest felt a little lighter. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid to find out. Outside, the rain began to fall softly, washing over the city like a quiet promise of renewal. Richard, still oblivious to Margaret's quiet resurgence, checks his phone again. Another notification about the missed payment flashes on the screen. This time, he doesn't ignore it. But the consequences of neglecting it for so long are already in motion. If you were Margaret, would you accept Richard's offer or make him watch you rise from the sidelines? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more stories that inspire and surprise. Margaret Thornton stood by the window of her modest two-bedroom apartment, the dim morning light casting soft shadows across the walls. Outside, the city hummed with activity. Buses groaned to life, pedestrians shuffled past in hurried steps, and the distant honk of horns punctuated the cold air. She could see the local bakery down the street, its warm glow inviting early customers. The smell of fresh bread should have comforted her, but it didn't reach her window today. Nothing did, except the weight of her growing worries. The room behind her was quiet, save for the faint hum of the radiator. The once cozy space, with its mismatched throw pillows and family photos hanging on the walls, now felt like a reminder of everything she'd lost. Margaret's gaze lingered on a photo from their honeymoon in Paris. Richard's arm wrapped around her waist as they stood by the Eiffel Tower, both of them smiling with the kind of joy that comes from shared ambition. How long ago had that been? A lifetime, it seemed. She tore her gaze away, unwilling to let herself fall into the trap of nostalgia. That Margaret, the hopeful one, had vanished the moment Richard began trading their partnership for power. She had spent years pretending that their marriage was still a partnership, quietly picking up the pieces as he drifted further into his world of million-dollar deals and younger women. But now, the pieces were too shattered to put back together, and the bills piling up on the kitchen counter were proof of it. She crossed the room, her slippers padding softly against the hardwood floor, and sat down at the small wooden table where an untouched cup of coffee had gone cold. The table was cluttered with overdue notices, letters from creditors, and reminders that her name was still tied to investments Richard had neglected. Her fingers trembled as she shuffled through them, the weight of each envelope pressing against her chest like a slow, suffocating force. Her phone vibrated, breaking the silence. The screen flashed a reminder. Meeting with bank representative, 10 a.m.? She sighed, running a hand through her shoulder-length brown hair. She had no intention of going. What was the point of meeting with someone who would only remind her of what she already knew? She was out of time, and the bank was out of patience. But another vibration followed, a message this time. James Donovan, don't cancel today. We need to talk afterward. Trust me. She exhaled sharply. James had always been persistent, even when they first met in college, where he had been the one to push her to apply for internships, enter competitions, and believe in her abilities. Back then, she was unstoppable. She had plans, dreams, and no fear of failure. But life, she realized, had a way of whittling you down, especially when you spent years being dismissed by the person who once admired your strength the most. With a resigned sigh, she grabbed her coat and stepped outside. The bank was as sterile and suffocating as Margaret remembered. Cold marble floors, the smell of freshly printed paper, and the sound of pens scratching against forms. She sat across from the representative, a man in his mid-30s with a polished demeanor and an expression that tried to be sympathetic but fell short. His glasses reflected the light as he tapped his pen against the desk, a nervous tick that irritated her more than it should. "I'm afraid we've reached the point where we need a firm decision," he said, sliding a document across the table. "We've given you multiple extensions, but without a payment plan or additional collateral, the property will be repossessed by the end of the quarter." Margaret's heart sank, but her face remained neutral. She had learned long ago that showing weakness in moments like this only gave people power over you. "I understand," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Is there any room for negotiation?" The man shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thornton. Our policies—" "Don't apologize," she interrupted, leaning forward slightly. "Just tell me what the options are." He hesitated before continuing. "If you can secure a co-signer with significant assets or provide proof of future income, we could reevaluate the terms. But given the current financials—" "Thank you," she said abruptly, cutting him off. "I'll see what I can do." The meeting ended with polite handshakes and forced smiles, but Margaret's mind was already racing with possibilities. As she stepped outside into the crisp air, she pulled out her phone and called James. "Margaret," he answered on the second ring, his voice warm and reassuring. "How did it go?" "Exactly how I expected," she replied, wrapping her scarf tighter around her neck. "They're not budging." "Then we need to talk," James said firmly. "Can you meet me at Donovan and Company in an hour?" She hesitated. It had been years since she'd stepped foot in any office that wasn't related to Richard's empire. But James wasn't offering her pity. He was offering her a lifeline. And for once, she didn't want to say no. "I'll be there," she said, hanging up. Donovan and Company occupied the top floor of a sleek glass building that overlooked the city skyline. Margaret's heels clicked against the marble as she made her way to the conference room, where James stood by the window, his silhouette framed against the backdrop of towering skyscrapers. He turned when he heard her enter, his blue eyes crinkling with warmth. "Margaret," he said, extending his hand. "It's good to see you." She smiled faintly, shaking his hand before taking a seat. "Thanks for making time." "For you?" "Always," he replied, sitting across from her. "I've been following what's happening with Richard's company." Margaret stiffened slightly but nodded. "I'm not involved in that anymore." "I know," James said, "but I also know you still have the instincts. And right now, I need someone with your vision." He slid a folder across the table, the weight of it resting heavily in her hands. She opened it to find detailed plans for a new venture, one focused on microfinancing for women entrepreneurs. It was bold, ambitious, and exactly the kind of project that had once lit a fire in her. "I've been putting this together for a while," James explained, "but I need someone who can refine it, expand it. Someone who understands both the financial and emotional side of these investments." Margaret's fingers traced the edge of the folder as she absorbed the information. Why me? She asked softly. Because you're the best, James replied without hesitation. And because I know you have something to prove, not to Richard, but to yourself. Her throat tightened, but she nodded. I don't have much to lose. No, James said, leaning forward. But you have everything to gain. The weight on Margaret's chest lifted slightly, replaced by something she hadn't felt in years, hope. She closed the folder and met James's gaze. Let's do this. Back in her apartment that evening, Margaret sat at the kitchen table, her mind buzzing with possibilities. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid of the obstacles. She had been overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated. But no more. As she sipped her tea, her phone buzzed with another message. Richard Thornton. Can we talk tomorrow about the property? She stared at the message for a moment before turning off the phone. She had her own priorities now, and Richard wasn't one of them. Margaret opens her laptop, typing the first draft of the business plan that will soon rival Richard's empire. The sleek, reflective exterior of the Thornton Group headquarters stretched into the sky like a modern-day Tower of Babel, its glass panels gleaming under the pale morning sun. From the outside, the building was a symbol of power and innovation. Richard Thornton's empire, built on bold investments and calculated risks. But inside, behind the polished facade, cracks were beginning to form. Richard strode into the executive lobby, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors. His tailored navy blue suit hugged his frame perfectly, and the faint scent of his expensive cologne followed him as he moved with the confidence of a man who was used to being in control. Yet today, there was a slight tension in his shoulders, a subtle stiffness in his gait that betrayed the unease simmering beneath his calm exterior. Good morning, Mr. Thornton, the receptionist greeted with a practiced smile. Richard nodded absently, barely registering her presence as he stepped into the private elevator. The ride to the top floor was silent, save for the soft hum of the machinery. As the doors slid open, he was greeted by the familiar sight of the executive suite, a space designed to exude both luxury and efficiency. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city below, but Richard barely glanced at it. He had bigger concerns. Amelia, he called out as he entered his office. Amelia Carter, his personal assistant, and now his mistress, was already seated at the long glass table, her laptop open and fingers flying over the keyboard. She looked up, her blonde hair cascading over her shoulders, and smiled. Morning. I've been prepping the materials for the acquisition meeting this afternoon. Everything's on track. Good. Richard loosened his tie slightly and sank into the leather chair across from her. How are the projections looking? Strong on paper, she replied, spinning the laptop around to show him the presentation. Graphs, figures, and market analysis filled the screen, all pointing toward one conclusion. The acquisition was crucial. Without it, Thornton Group's growth trajectory would stall, and the board wouldn't be pleased. But I have to warn you, there's been some chatter among the investors. They're worried about the market volatility. Richard frowned, tapping his fingers against the armrest. Let them worry. That's what they pay us for, to manage risk. As long as we stick to the plan, we'll be fine. Still, Amelia said, leaning forward, her voice dropping slightly. It wouldn't hurt to show them that we have contingencies in place. Just to reassure them, he sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. Amelia was sharp, no doubt about it, and she had a knack for anticipating potential pitfalls. That's what made her valuable, beyond the obvious reasons. But this deal wasn't something he could afford to second-guess. It had taken months of negotiations to get here, and any sign of hesitation would be seen as weakness. I'll handle the board, he said firmly, closing the laptop. We've come too far to back down now. Before Amelia could respond, Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw a text from his CFO, Greg Hastings. Urgent. Need to discuss competitor interference before the meeting. Richard's brow furrowed. Competitor interference wasn't unusual in his world, but the timing couldn't be worse. He quickly dialed Greg's number. Richard, Greg answered, his tone brisk. We've got a problem. What kind of problem? Richard asked, already bracing himself. Another firm is targeting our key clients. 3 of them have delayed signing renewal contracts because they're considering offers from the competitor. Richard's jaw tightened. Which firm? Greg hesitated for a moment before replying, it's a new player, small but aggressive. They've been under the radar until now, but they're gaining traction fast. Richard leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He prided himself on knowing every significant player in the market, but this was unexpected. Do we know who's behind it? Not yet, Greg admitted, but we're digging into it. I'll have more details before the meeting. Good, Richard said, ending the call. He sat in silence for a moment, processing the information. A small, aggressive firm targeting his clients? It wasn't a coincidence. Someone was making moves, and they were doing it quietly enough to catch him off guard. What's going on? Amelia asked, watching him closely. Potential competitor trying to poach our clients, Richard muttered. I need you to work with Greg and get me a full report on their strategy. Amelia nodded, already pulling up files on her laptop. Do you think it's one of the usual suspects? No, Richard replied, his gaze hardening. Whoever it is, they're new, and they know exactly where to hit us. By noon, Richard was in the conference room, surrounded by the senior leadership team. The table was covered in documents, charts, and financial forecasts, but the mood was tense. Greg stood at the front, presenting the latest findings. The firm's name is Horizon Dynamics, Greg said, clicking through the presentation slides. They've been operating under the radar for about a year, but in the last 3 months, they've secured contracts with several mid-sized companies. Now, they're going after larger accounts, ours included. Richard studied the data on the screen, his mind piecing together the puzzle. Horizon Dynamics wasn't just any startup. Their strategy was too precise, their timing too calculated. Someone with experience was behind this. Do we have a lead on their CEO? Richard asked. Greg nodded. We're still confirming, but it appears to be James Donovan. Richard froze for a moment, the name triggering a cascade of memories. James had been a familiar face in his early career, a mentor to Margaret, back when she was the financial genius who helped him build the foundation of his company. But why would James be targeting him now? And then it hit him, Margaret. He hadn't thought of her as a serious player in years, but if she was involved with Horizon Dynamics, this wasn't just business. It was personal. Richard. Amelia's voice pulled him back to the present. Do you know him? Barely. He lied, masking the storm brewing inside him. But if he's working with Margaret, then we've underestimated them. The room fell silent. Greg cleared his throat awkwardly. What's the plan then? Richard leaned forward, his fingers interlaced as he considered his options. We hit back, he said finally. Double down on the acquisition. If we can secure this deal, it'll give us the leverage we need to block Horizon Dynamics from expanding further. And Margaret? Amelia asked carefully, her gaze steady. Richard hesitated. The thought of facing Margaret in the boardroom unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He had dismissed her for so long that the idea of her being a legitimate threat felt almost surreal. But the facts were in front of him, and ignoring them would be a mistake. I'll deal with Margaret, he said, his voice cold. She doesn't know what she's getting into. But as the meeting wrapped up and the team dispersed, a nagging thought remained at the back of his mind. What if she does know? What if she's been planning this for years? He brushed the thought aside and headed back to his office. The game had changed, but Richard Thornton wasn't about to lose. Not to Margaret. Not to anyone. As Richard reviews the competitor's financial reports, his phone buzzes with a notification. An upcoming industry event where Horizon Dynamics is listed as a featured guest. And leading the presentation, Margaret Thornton. Margaret sat in the back seat of the town car, her fingers clutching a sleek leather-bound folder resting on her lap. The rhythmic hum of the car on the road did little to calm the storm swirling inside her. The weight of the past few days, late-night phone calls, strategic meetings, and carefully worded emails pressed down on her like a second skin. Outside the window, the city's financial district flashed by, towering buildings casting long shadows over the bustling streets below. But Margaret wasn't intimidated by the imposing skyline. Not anymore. As the car slowed to a stop in front of a modern, glass-walled office building, Margaret exhaled slowly and smoothed down the fabric of her navy blazer. She adjusted the delicate gold necklace that rested against her collarbone, a gift from James Donovan when she first joined his project. It wasn't extravagant, but its simplicity reminded her of her roots. She wasn't here to flash wealth. She was here to take control. The driver opened her door, and she stepped out, heels clicking against the polished pavement as she entered the building. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the faint aroma of new leather greeted her as she passed through the lobby, her steps measured and confident. She had rehearsed this moment in her head 1,000 times. But now that it was here, adrenaline buzzed beneath her skin. The elevator ride to the 15th floor was quiet, the mirrored walls reflecting her composed exterior. Margaret's reflection stared back at her, dark brown hair neatly styled, eyes sharp and focused, and a hint of determination in the slight tilt of her chin. She had changed, she realized. The woman who once lived in Richard Thornton's shadow was gone. In her place stood someone who had fought to reclaim her identity, her voice, and her worth. The doors opened with a soft chime, revealing the sleek conference room where James and a small group of investors waited. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a golden glow over the polished wooden table. The room buzzed with quiet conversations, but all eyes turned toward Margaret as she entered. James stood and greeted her with a warm smile, his hand extended. "Margaret, right on time." She shook his hand firmly, the gesture carrying more than politeness. It was a silent acknowledgement of the trust they had built. "I wouldn't miss it," she replied, her voice steady. As she took her seat, she glanced around the table, taking note of the key players present. There was Helena Shaw, a venture capitalist known for her no-nonsense approach to business. Marcus Bell, a tech entrepreneur with a reputation for bold investments, and Tom Kwan, a financial strategist with a sharp eye for market trends. They weren't just potential backers. They were gatekeepers to the industry's upper echelons. James began the meeting with a brief introduction, highlighting the purpose of the session and the potential impact of their project. But Margaret knew this wasn't just about numbers or projections. It was about selling a vision. She waited patiently as James set the stage, her fingers brushing lightly over the edge of her folder. "And now," James said, turning to her with a nod, "I'd like to introduce Margaret Thornton, our strategic lead. She's been instrumental in refining our approach and positioning us for sustainable growth. Margaret, the floor is yours." She stood, the room quieting as she walked to the front. She placed the folder on the table, opened it, and projected the presentation onto the screen behind her. But she didn't dive straight into the slides. Instead, she took a moment to look each investor in the eye, establishing a connection before she spoke. "I know what you're thinking," she began, her tone conversational but firm. "Why should you trust a startup to deliver what larger firms have failed to do? Why take the risk when you could invest in something more predictable?" A few of them shifted slightly in their seats, intrigued by her directness. "The answer," she continued, "is because we're not just another company chasing short-term gains. We're building something that addresses an overlooked market, women entrepreneurs seeking access to capital without the traditional barriers. And we're doing it with precision, scalability, and a deep understanding of the financial landscape." She clicked to the first slide, which displayed a graph showing the exponential growth of female-led businesses over the past decade. This market isn't just growing, it's thriving. But traditional financial institutions have failed to adapt. They see this as a niche. We see it as an opportunity. As she moved through the presentation, Margaret's confidence grew. She spoke about the gaps in the current lending market, the inefficiencies of existing models, and the ways her company would leverage technology to create personalized financial solutions. But she didn't just rely on numbers. She shared stories of real women who had been denied funding despite having viable businesses. She painted a picture of what success could look like if they dared to think differently. By the time she reached the final slide, the room was silent. She closed the presentation and faced the group. "We're not just asking for your investment. We're inviting you to be part of a movement that redefines how we think about financial inclusion. Together, we can create something that not only generates profit, but also leaves a lasting impact." For a moment, no one spoke. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest, but she maintained her composure, waiting for their response. Helena Shaw was the first to break the silence. She leaned back in her chair, tapping a manicured nail against the table. "Impressive," she said, her gaze sharp. "But I want to know, how do you plan to compete with established players who have deeper pockets and more resources?" Margaret didn't miss a beat. "We're not competing with them head-on. We're targeting a specific segment they've overlooked. Our agility allows us to adapt faster and offer customized solutions that larger firms can't. And with your backing, we'll have the resources to scale without losing that flexibility." Marcus Bell nodded thoughtfully. "What about your contingency plans? What happens if the market shifts unexpectedly?" Margaret smiled, anticipating the question. "We've built multiple layers of risk mitigation into our model. Diversified portfolios, strategic partnerships, and adaptive technology will allow us to pivot when necessary. And we're not just reacting to market trends. We're predicting them." Tom Kwan leaned forward, a hint of a smile playing at the corner of his lips. "You've done your homework," he said. "I like that." James jumped in, sensing the momentum shifting in their favor. "Margaret has been instrumental in building a foundation that isn't just strong. It's forward-thinking. With your support, we can turn this vision into a reality." After a few more questions and discussions, the investors exchanged glances, silently communicating their thoughts. Helena was the first to speak again. "I'm in," she said, her tone decisive. "But I want quarterly updates and a seat at the table for major decisions." Marcus and Tom quickly followed suit, each offering their terms. Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she remained composed, thanking them for their confidence and outlining the next steps. As the meeting wrapped up, James pulled her aside. "You did it," he said, pride evident in his voice. "We did it," Margaret corrected, though she knew this victory was as much hers as it was the team's. As she walked out of the building, the crisp afternoon air filled her lungs, and for the first time in years, she felt truly alive. The doubts that had haunted her faded, replaced by a sense of purpose. Margaret received a text as she stepped into the car. "See you at the industry event. Let's talk, Richard." She smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that suggested she was intimidated. This time, she was ready to face him. The tension in Richard Thornton's office was suffocating, like the thick, humid air before a storm. The blinds were partially drawn, casting shadows across the sleek mahogany desk where he sat, staring at the flickering screen of his laptop. His tie was loosened, the top button of his crisp white shirt undone, but the small relief it offered did little to ease the pressure building in his chest. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the desk, a habit he hadn't indulged in since his early days of struggling to establish Thornton Group. Back then, he thrived on pressure. But this was different. The numbers on the screen told a story of decline, one that Richard hadn't been prepared for. Quarterly projections were off by nearly 15%, key clients had delayed signing renewals, and investor confidence was slipping. Even the acquisition he had worked tirelessly to secure wasn't the surefire victory he had once believed it to be. His empire, once untouchable, was beginning to wobble on its foundations, and the whispers of doubt among his board members had grown louder. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. He had spent years building this company, making bold decisions and taking risks that paid off. But somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of the details. The small cracks that, when ignored, had grown into fractures. And now, Margaret's name had resurfaced, like a ghost from his past, threatening to haunt his carefully curated world. His phone buzzed on the desk, the vibration rattling against the wood like an unwelcome reminder of how quickly things were spiraling. It was Greg Hastings, his CFO. Richard answered on the second ring. "Greg, we've got a situation," Greg said without preamble. His tone clipped and urgent. "3 more clients have pulled out of negotiations. They're moving to Horizon Dynamics." Richard clenched his jaw, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the phone. 3 more? "Yes," Greg confirmed. "And it's not just them. The board's getting antsy. I had 2 members call me this morning asking if you have a plan to counter this." Richard stood and paced to the window, staring out at the city below. The view that had once filled him with pride now felt like a taunt, as if the skyscrapers were silently judging him. "We're not going to lose more clients," he said, his voice hard. "I'll handle it." Greg hesitated. "Richard, if we don't act fast, this could snowball. Horizon Dynamics isn't just poaching clients. They're making us look outdated. Margaret's strategy is targeted, and it's working." The mention of Margaret's name sent a wave of frustration through him, but he refused to let it show. "We're not outdated," he snapped. "They're just leveraging temporary weaknesses." "Maybe," Greg said carefully, "but temporary or not, the perception is shifting. We need to turn it around." Richard ended the call without responding, tossing the phone onto the couch as he rubbed his temples. Margaret had been quiet for years, content to live in the background while he made headlines. But now, she was making moves with surgical precision, and he couldn't deny the effectiveness of her approach. She wasn't coming at him with flashy announcements or aggressive takeovers. She was chipping away at the foundation, one client at a time. The knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Amelia stepped in, her expression neutral but her eyes betraying a hint of concern. "I thought you'd want to see this," she said, holding out a tablet. Richard took it, scanning the headline of the industry news article, "Horizon Dynamics, the rising star redefining financial services." Beneath it was a photo of Margaret standing confidently at a podium during a recent press conference, her gaze steady and her smile subtle but powerful. "She's getting more attention," Amelia said, sitting down across from him. "Investors are starting to notice her success. It's not just about poaching clients anymore. It's about positioning." "I see that," Richard muttered, setting the tablet down. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. "She's built this company quietly, right under my nose." Amelia crossed her legs, tapping her fingers against the armrest of the chair. "She had time. Years, actually. And now, she's using everything she learned from you and turning it into her own strategy." The word stung more than Richard wanted to admit. He had always known Margaret was brilliant. After all, her financial acumen had been a cornerstone of his early success. But he had assumed that brilliance had dimmed over the years, buried beneath the weight of domestic responsibilities and their crumbling marriage. He had been wrong. Margaret's light hadn't dimmed. It had been redirected. "What's the plan?" Amelia asked, bringing him back to the present. Richard stood, buttoning his jacket. "We go on the offensive. I want a list of our most vulnerable clients by the end of the day. We'll offer them incentives to stay. Discounted rates, custom packages, whatever it takes." "And Margaret?" Amelia raised an eyebrow. "I'll handle her personally," Richard said, his tone cold and decisive. "She wants to play in my world? Fine. But she doesn't know what it's like to be on the receiving end of my full attention." By the time the evening rolled around, Richard was back in his penthouse, nursing a glass of bourbon as he reviewed the list Amelia had sent. The names of the clients who had jumped ship burned into his mind like a brand. He prided himself on loyalty, on building relationships that lasted. But Margaret had exploited a weakness he hadn't seen coming. She knew the inner workings of his company, the gaps in his strategies, and the blind spots he had ignored. The room was dimly lit, the glow of the city lights casting long shadows across the walls. He stared out at the skyline, the weight of his thoughts pressing down like an invisible hand. He had always been the one in control, the one who called the shots. But now, for the first time, he felt like he was playing catch-up. His phone buzzed again, and this time, he didn't ignore it. It was a text from an unfamiliar number. "See you at the event tomorrow. Let's see what you've got. M. Margaret." Richard's lips pressed into a thin line as he read the message again, his mind racing. She was challenging him, and the thought sent a surge of adrenaline through his veins. If she wanted a fight, she would get one. But he wasn't just going to defend his territory. He was going to take back what was his. The next morning, the industry event was in full swing, with executives and investors mingling over glasses of champagne and trays of hors d'oeuvres. The venue was luxurious, with chandeliers casting a warm glow over the marble floors and gold-accented decor. Richard entered the grand hall with purpose, his gaze scanning the room until it landed on her. Margaret stood near a cluster of investors, effortlessly commanding their attention. She was wearing a tailored black dress that exuded power and sophistication. and her laughter floated through the air like a melody he hadn't heard in years. She wasn't the woman he remembered. She was sharper, more confident, and equal. For a moment, Richard felt something unfamiliar, pride, but it was quickly overshadowed by the realization that she wasn't on his side anymore. He made his way toward her, his presence causing a few heads to turn. When their eyes met, Margaret's smile didn't falter. If anything, it widened slightly, as if she had been expecting him. "Richard," she said warmly, "I was wondering when you'd show up." He stopped in front of her, his expression neutral but his eyes locked on hers. "We need to talk." "Of course," she replied, excusing herself from the group. "Shall we find somewhere private?" As they walked toward a quieter corner of the venue, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that the balance of power between them had shifted. Margaret was no longer the woman waiting for his approval. She was the one setting the terms. As they sat across from each other in the private lounge, Margaret leaned in slightly, her voice low but firm. "Let's be clear, Richard. This isn't a reunion. It's a negotiation." Richard's breath hitched. For the first time, he realized that Margaret wasn't playing his game. She had rewritten the rules. The city glittered beneath the evening sky, a sprawling maze of lights and ambition. From the corner office of Horizon Dynamics, Margaret Thornton watched it all unfold. She stood by the window, the glass cool against her fingertips as she traced the familiar skyline, one that used to symbolize Richard's world. But tonight, it felt different. The towering buildings and bustling streets weren't just reminders of his dominance anymore. They were symbols of her own. Behind her, the office hummed with quiet activity. Phones rang in distant corners, keyboards clicked steadily, and the faint murmur of conversations filled the air. This wasn't the chaotic energy of a startup. It was the measured confidence of a company on the rise. And Margaret had orchestrated every step of its ascent. She turned away from the window as James Donovan entered, carrying a tablet and a cup of tea. He placed both on the table near her and took a seat, stretching his legs as he exhaled. "You've been quiet since the event," he observed, his tone light but curious. Margaret smiled faintly, taking a sip of the tea. "Just thinking." "About Richard?" James asked, raising an eyebrow. Her silence was answer enough. James chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "I don't blame you." He didn't see any of this coming. Margaret set the cup down and folded her hands in her lap. "He underestimated me," she said softly, but there was no bitterness in her voice, only a quiet determination. "But I'm not interested in revenge. This is about proving to myself that I can stand on my own." "And you've done more than that," James replied. "We're close to finalizing the deal with Langston Financial, which will give us access to the international markets." "That's the final piece of the puzzle." Margaret nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead, considering the implications. Langston Financial had been one of Richard's most reliable partners for years, and acquiring them would be a symbolic victory as much as a strategic one. But she wasn't doing this just to outshine Richard. She was building something sustainable, something that would last beyond her personal triumph. "Have they agreed to the terms?" she asked, pulling the tablet toward her to review the latest updates. "They're on board," James confirmed. "We'll need you to lead the final negotiation, though. Langston's CEO respects you, but he'll want reassurances before committing fully." Margaret tapped her fingers lightly against the table, her mind already formulating the pitch she would deliver. "Schedule the meeting for tomorrow," she said. "Let's close this." The following morning, Margaret arrived at the Langston Financial headquarters with the same calm resolve that had carried her through every major milestone of her career. Dressed in a tailored charcoal gray pantsuit, she exuded an air of authority that couldn't be ignored. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floors as she made her way to the conference room, where the Langston team was waiting. The room was sleek and modern, with glass walls offering a panoramic view of the city. Langston's CEO, David Langston, stood as she entered, extending his hand with a warm smile. He was an older man, with silver hair and a presence that commanded respect without intimidation. "Margaret," he said, shaking her hand firmly. "It's good to see you again." "Likewise," she replied, taking her seat at the long glass table. "I appreciate you making time for this." David nodded toward the stack of documents in front of him. Your proposal is impressive, but I have a few questions before we move forward. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her posture open and confident. I'd be happy to address them. The discussion that followed was a test of strategy and finesse. David's questions were precise, probing the potential risks and long-term viability of the partnership. But Margaret had anticipated every concern. She spoke with clarity and conviction, weaving data with vision and balancing optimism with practicality. By the time she finished, David sat back in his chair, visibly impressed. I have to admit, he said, you've thought of everything. I've had good mentors, Margaret replied, thinking briefly of her early years with Richard before things changed. But more importantly, I believe in what we're building. David studied her for a moment, then smiled. So do I. Let's make it official. Back at Horizon Dynamics, the celebration was understated but meaningful. The core team gathered in the main conference room, toasting to their success with glasses of champagne. James raised his glass, his voice warm as he addressed the group. To Margaret, he said, and to a future built on vision, resilience, and hard work. Margaret smiled, clinking glasses with her colleagues. The victory felt different from any she had experienced before. More personal, more profound. She wasn't just celebrating a business deal. She was celebrating the fact that she had reclaimed her identity and her power. As the team dispersed, Margaret returned to her office, where her phone buzzed with a message. Congratulations. I hear Langston is in good hands. Let's talk. Richard. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before she placed the phone face down on the desk. She wasn't ready to deal with him just yet. There were still pieces of the puzzle that needed to fall into place. James appeared at the door, leaning against the frame with a knowing smile. You're not going to respond? Not yet, Margaret replied, standing and gathering her things. I have bigger things to focus on. The following week, Margaret attended a high-profile financial summit where Horizon Dynamics had been invited to present as one of the fastest-growing firms in the industry. The event was held at an upscale hotel, with chandeliers casting a golden glow over the grand ballroom. Executives and investors mingled over cocktails, their conversations punctuated by bursts of laughter and clinking glasses. Margaret stood near the edge of the room, observing the crowd. She had always preferred watching from the sidelines, analyzing the dynamics before making her move. But tonight, she wasn't just an observer. She was a player. Impressive turnout, James said, joining her with a glass of wine in hand. Indeed, Margaret replied, scanning the room. It's a good opportunity to solidify our position. As she spoke, her gaze landed on Richard, who had just entered the room. He was impeccably dressed, as always, but there was something different about him. His usual air of invincibility seemed slightly diminished, replaced by a subtle tension in his posture. Their eyes met across the room, and for a brief moment, time seemed to slow. He's coming over, James noted, taking a step back to give them space. Good luck. Margaret took a deep breath as Richard approached, his expression unreadable. Margaret, he said, his voice warm but cautious. We seem to keep running into each other. Funny how that happens, she replied, her smile polite but guarded. Can we talk? He asked, gesturing toward a quieter corner of the room. She hesitated for a moment before nodding. As they walked, the noise of the crowd faded, leaving only the sound of their footsteps against the marble floor. They found a small seating area near the balcony, where the night air drifted in through the open doors. Richard sat across from her, his gaze steady. You've been busy. So have you, Margaret replied, crossing her legs and leaning back slightly. But I'm guessing this isn't a social call. No, he admitted. I wanted to congratulate you. Horizon Dynamics is making waves, and the deal with Langston was a smart move. Margaret tilted her head slightly, studying him. Thank you. But you didn't come here just to offer compliments, did you? He chuckled softly, running a hand through his hair. No, I didn't. I'm here because we're on a collision course, and we both know it. She didn't flinch. So what are you suggesting? A truce, Richard said, his voice lower. We can find a way to coexist without tearing each other down. Margaret considered his words carefully, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. But as much as she appreciated the sentiment, She knew that coexistence wasn't what she wanted. "I don't think you understand," she said, leaning forward slightly. "I'm not interested in a truce, Richard. I'm interested in winning." Richard's breath caught, but Margaret remained composed. For the first time, it was clear that this wasn't just business. It was her moment to claim everything she had been denied. The soft glow of twilight bathed the city in shades of amber and lavender as Richard Thornton leaned against the balcony railing of his penthouse, the glass of bourbon in his hand warming against his skin. Below him, the city pulsed with life. Car horns blared, streetlights flickered on, and the distant hum of conversations rose like a gentle hum. But the world outside felt disconnected from him tonight, as if it were happening in a parallel universe he no longer had access to. The wind rustled his dark hair as he took a slow sip, savoring the familiar burn of the alcohol. He had lost count of how many nights he had spent like this in recent weeks, alone, reflective, and restless. His empire, once a beacon of stability and prestige, was unraveling before his eyes. Every day brought new challenges, new setbacks, and Margaret's name was at the center of it all. Horizon Dynamics wasn't just competing with Thornton Group, it was overtaking it. He could still see her face from their encounter at the summit last week, the way she had spoken with quiet confidence, as if she had already won. Her words echoed in his mind. "I'm not interested in a truce. I'm interested in winning." And she was winning. His phone buzzed on the table behind him, and he turned reluctantly, setting down his glass before picking up the device. The name on the screen made him pause. Amelia Carter. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Amelia." "Richard," she said, her voice smooth but laced with urgency. "I just left the board meeting." His grip on the phone tightened. "I wasn't aware there was a meeting tonight." "They didn't want you to be," Amelia replied. "That's why I'm calling. They're losing faith, Richard. They're discussing contingency plans in case you can't turn things around." He closed his eyes briefly, the weight of her words settling like lead in his chest. "What kind of contingency plans?" "Replacing you as CEO," she said softly. "They haven't made a decision yet, but the conversation is moving in that direction. They're worried about the investors pulling out, and they think new leadership could stabilize things." Richard paced back to the balcony, the cool night air doing little to calm the storm inside him. "Let me guess. Greg Hastings is leading the charge?" Amelia hesitated. "He's one of them, yes. But it's not just him. They're being pressured by external advisors who think Horizon Dynamics is going to crush us if we don't act fast." "And what do you think?" he asked, his voice quieter now. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "I think you're the only one who can fix this," she said finally. "But you don't have much time." Richard exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Thanks for telling me." "Don't thank me," she replied. "Just do something about it." The line went dead, and Richard set the phone down on the railing, his mind racing. He couldn't afford to lose control. Not now, when Margaret was so close to delivering the final blow. But what could he do? Every move he made seemed to backfire, and Margaret's strategy was flawless. She knew him too well, anticipated his decisions, and stayed one step ahead. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had once dismissed her as someone who lacked vision, and now she was the reason his vision was crumbling. The next morning, Richard arrived at Thornton Group earlier than usual, the building still quiet as the city woke up. He sat in his office, the sunlight streaming through the windows, illuminating the stacks of documents scattered across his desk. Financial reports, client retention strategies, competitor analyses, they all told the same story of decline. But there was one report that caught his attention. It was a detailed breakdown of Horizon Dynamics' recent acquisitions, including a small but influential financial advisory firm that had been a key partner for Thornton Group. Margaret had strategically absorbed them into her network, cutting off one of his company's most valuable resources. He stared at the report, his mind churning. Margaret wasn't just building her empire. She was dismantling his. And she was doing it with the precision of someone who knew exactly where to strike. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called out. Greg Hastings entered, his expression guarded. He was dressed in his usual sharp suit, but there was a tension in his posture that hadn't been there before. "Got a minute?" Richard gestured toward the chair across from him. Let me guess. You're here to talk about the board. Greg sat down, folding his hands in his lap. They're nervous, Richard. Investors are nervous. We've lost 6 key clients in the last month alone, and Horizon Dynamics is gaining momentum. If we don't turn this around soon, I know, Richard interrupted, leaning forward, but replacing me won't solve the problem. The damage has already been done, and putting someone else in this chair won't stop Margaret from taking more. Greg nodded slowly. Then what's the plan? Richard hesitated. For the first time in his career, he didn't have a clear answer, but he couldn't admit that. Not to Greg, not to the board, and certainly not to himself. I'm meeting with Margaret today, he said finally. I'll find out what she wants. Greg raised an eyebrow. You think she'll back off? No, Richard admitted, but I need to know what her endgame is. If we're going to survive this, we have to understand her intentions. Greg stood, smoothing his tie. Just don't wait too long. The board won't. As the door closed behind him, Richard leaned back in his chair, his thoughts drifting to the meeting he had arranged with Margaret later that afternoon. He had spent years underestimating her, but now he knew better. She wasn't the same woman who had once stood by his side, quietly supporting his dreams. She had her own dreams now, and they didn't include him. The restaurant was elegant and discreet, the kind of place where high-profile deals were made without prying eyes. Richard arrived early, choosing a secluded booth near the back where they could speak privately. He ordered a scotch, sipping it slowly as he watched the door. When Margaret walked in, the room seemed to shift. She was dressed in a deep emerald green dress, the color accentuating the confidence she carried effortlessly. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she approached him, her gaze steady and unreadable. "Richard," she said, sliding into the booth across from him. "I wasn't sure you'd show." "I could say the same about you," he replied, signaling for the waiter to bring her a drink. Margaret accepted the glass of wine, but didn't touch it. "So, what's this about?" He studied her for a moment, taking in the way she held herself, poised, controlled, and completely unshaken. "I want to know what you're after," he said finally. "Is this about revenge?" She tilted her head slightly, considering the question. "If it were, you'd already be out of business." "Then what is it?" he pressed. Margaret leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "This is about creating something that's mine. Something that can't be taken away, dismissed, or ignored. I spent years building your dreams, Richard. Now, I'm building mine." He swallowed hard, her words cutting deeper than he expected. "And there's no room for compromise?" "There was," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "But that time passed the day you chose someone else over me." Richard sat back, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy fog. He had always believed that power was about winning at any cost. But now, as he looked at the woman sitting across from him, he realized that power could also be about walking away and knowing you didn't need anyone to validate your success. Margaret stood, smoothing her dress as she prepared to leave. "I'll see you at the next board meeting," she said, her tone neutral but final. As she walked away, Richard remained seated, the sound of her heels fading into the distance. For the first time in his life, he felt the sting of losing, not just a business rival, but the woman he had once taken for granted. His phone buzzed with a message from Greg. "We need to talk. It's urgent." But Richard already knew. Margaret's victory wasn't just inevitable. It was already here. The conference room at the Thornton Group headquarters was unusually quiet. The familiar hum of activity that typically surrounded the heart of the company had dimmed, replaced by an uneasy stillness. Outside, the city's morning light streamed through the glass walls, casting long shadows on the glossy oak table where Richard Thornton sat, flanked by members of the board. His fingers rested against the edge of a leather folder, but he wasn't reading its contents. His gaze was distant, fixed on the skyline beyond the windows, as if searching for an escape that wasn't there. The boardroom was packed, yet it felt suffocatingly empty to Richard. Faces that had once looked at him with respect now regarded him with thinly veiled impatience. Greg Hastings sat directly across from him, flipping through financial statements with a frown that deepened by the second. The tension was palpable, hanging in the air like a storm cloud about to burst. We're running out of options, Richard, Greg said, breaking the silence. The investors are on edge, and with Horizon Dynamics absorbing more of our market share, we have to act now. Richard's jaw tightened. He knew what was coming. He had seen the signs long before this meeting was called. He had ignored them, believing that his legacy would protect him. But now, Margaret's name was on everyone's lips, her company's meteoric rise casting a long shadow over his empire. We have a proposal, Greg continued, sliding a document across the table. We merge with Horizon Dynamics. The room fell silent as the weight of those words sank in. Richard didn't touch the document. He didn't need to. He already knew what it said. The terms of the merger would be in Margaret's favor. She held the leverage, the power, and the ability to dictate the future of both companies. This isn't just about survival, Greg added. It's about positioning ourselves for the future. Margaret's vision is aligned with where the market is heading, and frankly, we need her. Richard exhaled slowly, his hands curling into fists beneath the table. The irony wasn't lost on him. Margaret, the woman he had dismissed, overlooked, and underestimated, was now the key to saving everything he had built. But it wasn't just about business anymore. It was personal. He wasn't sure he could swallow his pride and hand over control to her, even if it meant survival. Before he could respond, the door to the boardroom opened and Margaret walked in. Her entrance was like a gust of fresh air, confident, composed, and undeniably commanding. She was dressed in a crisp white blouse and tailored navy blazer, her hair pulled back into a sleek bun that accentuated her sharp features. She greeted the room with a polite nod, her gaze settling briefly on Richard before moving on. Margaret, Greg said, standing to shake her hand. Thank you for coming on short notice. Of course, she replied smoothly, taking the seat at the head of the table, Richard's seat. No one questioned it. She placed her own folder on the table and opened it with the precision of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. I've reviewed the merger proposal, she began, her voice calm but firm. And while I agree that consolidation is the logical step forward, there are a few terms I'd like to discuss. Richard leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. You're already making demands? Margaret met his gaze without flinching. I'm negotiating, she corrected. It's what we do, isn't it? The room tensed, but Margaret didn't miss a beat. She outlined her terms with precision, focusing on areas where Thornton Group would benefit from Horizon Dynamics resources and vice versa. But the key condition was clear. She would assume the role of CEO, with Richard stepping down to an advisory position. That's non-negotiable, she said, closing her folder. The market needs to see a clear shift in leadership. Stability won't be achieved if we cling to the past. Richard's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of what was slipping away. And if I don't agree? Margaret tilted her head slightly, a hint of sadness flickering in her eyes. Then the board will vote to replace you, and the merger will happen regardless. I'm offering you a chance to have a say in how it unfolds. Her words weren't harsh, but they were final. She wasn't here to gloat or revel in his downfall. She was here to finish what she had started. Silence stretched across the room as the weight of her offer sank in. Richard's mind raced, memories flashing like a film reel. Their early days building the company together, the nights spent brainstorming ideas, the dreams they once shared. But those memories were stained now, tainted by years of neglect and betrayal. He had pushed her away, and now she was pushing him out. I need a moment, he said, standing abruptly and leaving the room before anyone could respond. Richard found himself on the rooftop terrace, the cool breeze biting at his skin as he stared out over the city. He hadn't come here to think. Thinking wouldn't change the reality of what was happening. He had come to breathe, to find a sliver of clarity amid the chaos. Footsteps approached from behind, and he didn't need to turn around to know it was Margaret. She stopped a few feet away, the wind tugging at the loose strands of hair framing her face. You didn't have to come, he said quietly. I wanted to, she replied, her voice softer now. This isn't easy for either of us. He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. It's easier for you. You're winning. Margaret stepped closer, her gaze fixed on the skyline. It's not about winning, Richard. It's about creating something that lasts. I spent years building your dream, And when you left me behind, I didn't know who I was anymore. But I found myself again. And now, I'm building my own legacy." He turned to face her, the pain in his eyes raw and unguarded. "I didn't mean for it to end like this." "I know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But it did. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind carried the distant sound of traffic, a reminder that life continued, even when everything else felt like it was falling apart. "I'll accept the terms," Richard said finally, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "But not because I want to. Because I have to." Margaret nodded, her expression unreadable. "You're making the right choice." "Maybe," he murmured, "but it doesn't feel like it." She reached out, resting her hand briefly on his arm. "You'll find your way, Richard, just like I did." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving him alone on the rooftop. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, but beneath the heaviness, there was a flicker of something else: acceptance. The following week, the merger was finalized, and the headlines told the world what Richard had known for months. Horizon Dynamics acquires Thornton Group in landmark deal. Margaret's photo accompanied every article, her name now synonymous with success. Richard watched the coverage from his empty office, the walls stripped of the photos and awards that had once defined his legacy. He had agreed to the advisory role, but he knew it wouldn't last. He would fade into the background, just as Margaret had once been expected to. But as he packed the last of his belongings into a box, he realized something. Margaret wasn't just his rival. She was the proof that the world didn't stop for anyone, not even him. As he walked out of the building for the final time, the sun warmed his face, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to breathe. Margaret had won. But maybe, just maybe, that wasn't the end of his story. In a distant corner office, Margaret sat at her new desk, staring out at the same skyline Richard had once admired. She wasn't thinking about him, though. She was thinking about the future, one she had built with her own hands, on her own terms, and she wasn't done yet.